Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! Welcome to the first episode of Turan Tales in 2026. Hope you had a great Christmas break, if you had one, and that you have already recovered after the New Year's Eve's fun. Before we move to the fascinating world of oil and gas, a few words about Turan Tales and our future. I'm planning to introduce a new format this year and to continue with the regular interviews and the audio documentaries. To this end, I need to ask you for help. I would like to keep all materials free to spread awareness of the region, so for now at least, I'm not planning to introduce any paywalls. But maintaining our team and the high quality of our work is not free. I work with two amazing sound designers, Tomek and Eva, without whom this project would be a mediocre DIY podcast that nobody would listen to. So it would be immensely helpful if you could support our team with a monthly or yearly subscription on Substack or one of several tiers of support available on my Buy Me a Coffee account. There you can also support us with a one-off donation. For a media startup like mine, every penny counts. You can find the links to my donation pages in my newsletter. And thank you to all of you who are already supporting us, whether by listening, sharing our materials, or financially. Now, today's episode will look at the fascinating story of oil and gas in Kazakhstan, the history of the industry, corruption scandals, environmental damages it likely causes, and much more. Joining us is Paolo Sorbello, a journalist and researcher based in Almaty, Kazakhstan. He's the English language editor of the independent news outlet Vlast, where he also hosts Dapte, a podcast for research in Central Asia. Paolo also holds a PhD from the University of Glasgow, for which he researched Kazakhstan's oil sector. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi Paolo, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Paolo is currently resting in Italy after his Christmas break, but we're bringing him back to Kazakhstan, which is his usual place of residence. And today, as we already discussed, we'll be talking about oil and gas. So what's the history of oil and gas industry in Kazakhstan, and what was its state when the Soviet Union collapsed and Kazakhstan became an independent country?
So, thank you for the question. And even when I'm in Italy, I'm never actually away from Kazakhstan. But no, to answer your question, let me take you back to 1899. Oil was first discovered, which was a new moment for the then Russian Empire. But the oil development in the west of the country, in the Atyrau region, what we now call the Atyrau region, was very slow in a way compared to modern paces, because at the time they needed to build railroads, they needed to build the infrastructure. And so when you see the development of the industry very, very slowly until actually the Second World War, when production shoots up, and that becomes a massive element of pride for people from the Soviet Union at that point, because they felt that they helped the war effort with their barrels of oil. And then after the war, in 1961, they found oil in Zhetebai, which is in today's Mangistau region. And that actually projected Kazakhstan into the oil industry of the Soviet Union. And that created an oil industry in Kazakhstan. And this is, to the observers, meant that more specialists showed up in Kazakhstan. They started building pipelines, they started building infrastructure that obviously were directed towards the center of the Soviet Union, so the industrial base of the Soviet Union. And so in this case, you can see that the oil industry starts being its own thing. And then you have 1979 with the discovery of Tengiz at the border between the today's Mangistau and Atrau region. And this now brings Kazakhstan into the top level of the Soviet oil industry, together with the Volga region, together with the Caucasus region, together with Siberia. So we reached the end of the Soviet Union with Kazakhstan being a full-fledged oil producer, and with important oil fields already discovered, and according to local and foreign specialists, a lot of undiscovered oil fields. And so that's when we have this initial investments from Western countries, from Western oil companies who flock into Kazakhstan to try their hand at the new ventures of this newly independent country.
But before the Western countries flocked into Kazakhstan to invest in its vast oil and gas fields, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapses, and for a moment, Kazakhstan becomes the only country making up the union, because it was the last one who actually declared independence. And what happens then? So the economy of Kazakhstan, just like of any other post-Soviet country at the time, was in shutters. And how it happens that a country undergoing a major economic crisis is becoming this massive and important oil and gas exporter?
Yeah, absolutely. So the makeup of the economy was definitely in a bad state. There were two things that were keeping it afloat, and that was the stability of the rule of Nazarbayev, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was the party secretary from the late 80s, from 89, who transited the country into independence, who won the first elections, who, established the first constitution. He was ruling the country effectively. And at the same time, the other pillar was oil, was the American investment in Tengiz, which was called the contract of the century, and established the joint venture Tengiz-Chevroil between Chevron and the Kazakh government. Tengiz-Chevroil became the largest oil producer in the country quickly, and essentially fueled the rule of Nazarbayev. One of the first questions I had in the early stages of my PhD was Kazakhstan first authoritarian or first an oil country, right? Or a rentier state, essentially. And that was a big question, because it's something that overlaps and interlocks. So the capital that came from oil exports and oil investment in Tengiz was crucial, actually, in keeping stability in the economy, and therefore also the possibility for Nazarbayev to create a patronage system that allowed him to rule without any adversary.
So, Paolo, tell us, when exactly did it happen? When did Kazakhstan become this oil exporting country?
That was pretty early. So Kazakhstan became a pretty early export-oriented oil producer. The main shift was in 2001 when the Caspian Pipeline Consortium was built. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium is called like that, but it's essentially a pipeline that goes around the Caspian into Russia and ends at the Novorossiysk port in Russia's Black Sea region. So that allowed oil, especially from Tengiz, to be exported directly to the sea, and therefore could be loaded onto tankers and could be sold by the major traders of oil in the Mediterranean and beyond. So that was the first major outlet for Kazakhstan that did not necessarily go through Russia in the sense of the old Soviet pipeline structure. And also the CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, was so-called international pipeline, which meant that it was subject not to local rules, but to international rules that made it a little bit more secure in terms of investment. And so all these companies, all these foreign companies that invested into the CPC were not that afraid of losing their investment. And we see CPC as a very important player for Kazakhstan today still, because it still exports around 80% of Kazakhstan's total oil exports.
I'm sure that not all of our listeners understand what the Caspian Pipeline Consortium is and what sort of companies make it up today. And on top of that, it would be great if you could explain who are the major stakeholders in the oil and gas sector in Kazakhstan and how they have influenced the Kazakh economy.
Right. So the CPC was the kind of the Western answer to their own investment, because they came. I'm talking about Chevron. I'm talking about ExxonMobil. I'm talking about Italian Eni, Shell, France Total. So these companies came and invested into Kazakhstan's oil sector in a very corporate, very Western way, moved by profits and trying to maximize their extraction capability. And so that's one side of the story. The other side of the story, meaning the geographical other side of the story, is China. In 1994, China became a net importer of oil. So it started needing oil more than it exported oil. And in 1996 already, it started investing in oil production in Kazakhstan. And then rapidly we see more and more investment from China. And in 2006, 2009, we have this completion of the Kazakhstan to China oil pipeline that brings essentially oil from central and also western Kazakhstan eastward towards Xinjiang, the autonomous region at the western part of China. It would be better to point to a map when talking about these geographic points, but you know what I mean. So there's a westbound direction, which is essentially fueled by Western oil companies' investment, and there's also an eastbound direction, which is mostly financed by Chinese investments.
Let's talk about the problems related to the oil and gas extraction in Kazakhstan, because these are plenty. The oil and gas extraction has, over the years, led to loads of criticism and even protests by local people whose work and whose livelihoods depend on oil and gas extraction. Can we talk about that? And can we talk about how the oil and gas business has affected local communities and why there are so many grievances related to this business?
Absolutely. I think you're right in pointing that oil investment might have not actually benefited the local people. And the reason being that most of the investment was essentially geared only towards the oil extraction industry. Some part of the investment was geared towards the center, so geared towards pleasing the politicians that were making the deals happen, and very little was geared towards the local communities. It's really a general story about Kazakhstan's oil industry that when you go to the fields, for example, you see that, or to the towns near the fields, you see that the development that you would expect from an oil country is not there. You go to Zhanaozen in the Mangistau region, and you don't see the same things you see in Saudi Arabia or in Norway.
Or in Astana, for that matter.
Exactly. Or in Astana. And that was my earlier point about, oil money actually not staying in the oil regions, but going towards center to finance the development of Astana, to finance major PR projects for the country, to finance also, again, the patronage system that was working in a way by which each region and each governor was involved in the oil extraction industry, and they were benefiting directly from it, and they were building their own kind of teams of people that were controlling the region, which at a point became problematic. And when that became problematic, then the regional governor became an enemy of the people. And so they were chased out of the country. So there's a lot of stories about power dynamic and power balance needing to be very carefully crafted so that everyone stayed in their place while the center essentially redistributed money in a way that is totally not the kind of developmental story that we would like to see when we hear about windfalls from natural resource extraction, especially for the local people.
The grievances related to the oil and gas industry sparked many protests over the course of Kazakhstan's independence. Can we talk about that? And especially, can we talk about what happened in Zhanaozen, which you already mentioned?
One of the grievances, for example, that led to mass protests was in 2010, 2011 in Zhanaozen, which this oil town, where about 150,000 people used to live, now is more than 200,000. And it's important that it's an oil town because, for example, let's say Tengiz is a very remote place where there's a worker village, which is a rotational village where only workers live. In Zhanaozen, families live, people live. It's a real town, but it's dependent on oil. And because it's dependent on oil, because it's still remote and the oil industry is hazardous and dangerous, they were used to obtaining a coefficient on top of their salary to earn essentially a little bit more money to be compensated for the risks for their health. And at some point, this was taken away. And then at some point, their special equipment was taken away. They did not have the right gloves. They did not have the right overalls. They did not have the right hard hats. And they were asked to do tasks that went beyond their contract. And so people started protesting. They said, why are you pushing us so hard? Why are you saving essentially money on our safety and security? And in 2010, they started with a few protests. And in 2011, there was a 8-month-long strike, which culminated on Independence Day, 16th of December, 2011, when the local government planned a celebration for the 20th anniversary of independence on the main square in Zhanaozen. The main square in Zhanaozen is exactly the place where workers were protesting for 8 consecutive months. And when the organizers of this festival arrived and literally pushed them away and said, please stop protesting, we need to build a stage and set up the nice festival, they said, well, there's nothing to be cheery about because we've been protesting and we would like our demands to be heard. And that's when, things got heated and, the protest got a little bit, let's call it violent in a way, because people started pushing back against the organizers of the festival. And that was a signal for the government to immediately actually send special forces to suppress the protest. And the suppression of this protest was much more violent than the protest itself and led to at least 18 people, but people talk about 80 people being killed by special forces. These people who were killed were all striking oil workers who had 0 weapons. They were not armed, not violent, absolutely not people who were trying to overthrow the government or anything. They were literally protesting oil workers who were just trying to be heard. And this was one of the loudest tragedies of Kazakhstan. And it's, again, totally related to the oil sector.
And what is the situation in Zhanaozen now? You obviously travel a lot as a reporter for Vlast, and you meet people in the west of Kazakhstan as well. So how do people remember this tragedy?
When you're in Zhanaozen and you talk to people in Russian, for example, they would say "sabitye," events. So, and the events is exactly December 2011. There's no mistake about it. So it's still very much into the memory of people. That led to some changes in terms of social contributions to the region, in terms of an attempt to appease the population by establishing new companies and rehiring the people that were fired. However, the Mangistau region is in a situation in which oil is not booming like it used to be, and therefore there's not that much space for oil workers. And obviously, if you live in an oil town and your father used to be an oilman, then you'd also dream to be an oilman, because if you work as an oilman, you make more than $1,000 equivalent a month. Whereas if you work as a waiter or as a welder or as a plumber, you make a few $100s a month. So obviously that's a social status, and not just a social status, because there's this famous saying among the Adai group of people in Kazakhstan that says that in the sky there's God, in the ground there's oil, and in the middle there's Adai. So the people that live in this Mangistau region feel very deeply connected to their subsoil, to the oil. Again, like I said before, it's embedded. The oil is embedded with life, and not having a job in oil means that both socioeconomically and as a symbol of pride, you're missing something. And so there's a lot of people actually in a list of unemployed people that are literally waiting for a job in oil, and they cannot take another job until they're selected, because otherwise they get dropped from the list. And so there's a lot of unemployed people in Zhanaozen that are literally waiting for their place in the sun, in a way.
Oil being part of the local identity is a fascinating subject, but that's not the only thing that I would like to discuss when it comes to problems, because there have been plenty of shocking stories about people, for example, becoming sick, fainting, or losing consciousness in northwestern Kazakhstan, close to the Karachaganak gas field. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So this story was part of the Caspian Cabal's investigation that Vlast was involved in, among other investigative newsrooms. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The Karachaganak oil field was discovered during the Soviet times. It produces mostly gas and also condensate, which can be processed as crude oil as well. And this field was kind of never really pushed to very contemporary technology, let's say. And so it kind of stayed always as a legacy project that was being updated and modernized, but it's not as, let's say, modern as Tengiz Kashagan became later on. And at some point in 2015, we had these examples of school children fainting, of people getting sleepier. Then there was another issue of Saigak and Telopi dying en masse, and nobody could actually put the finger on the pulse and understand exactly what was going on. The only variable that was clearly there was the vicinity, the proximity to the oil field. And so people were started to started to doubt or connect whether it was the gas field that was leaking something in the air that was essentially toxic and affecting the livelihood of people. This is something that is very important, I believe, to point out beyond the single story, because we see this in every single instance of oil and gas production. We see that the monitoring bodies, so the ecology department or the labor inspectorate, they're basically powerless against these companies because they cannot visit the sites unannounced because of safety procedures. So all these sites are closed off from the population, but also closed off from the monitoring bodies. And so if you want to do an inspection, you have to call 24 hours in advance. The regular inspections are, fixated at the beginning of the year. There's a fixed date. You that own oil field, you know that the inspectorate will come on the 5th of March. And so you get ready for the 5th of March so that everything is perfect and in order. And then, you can continue doing whatever you're doing from the 6th of March onwards. So the idea is that it's very, very difficult for both the government, but also NGOs and other independent monitoring to actually check what's happening in terms of environmental damage and in terms of damage that could also actually affect the people. Gas is invisible, right? So a couple of years ago, there was the largest gas leak in the history of Kazakhstan as recorded. And when we started asking the local authorities to check and to tell us more, because we could see the gas leak from the satellites, and the satellites were showing clearly the wave of gas, the plumes that were coming out of this gas field, the people on the ground said that they couldn't see anything. And we answered, yes, of course you can't see anything. Gas is invisible, but you have to try to monitor it in a different way. And we see it from the sky, so it must be there. And so they started flaring the gas and they could see that there was a leak. And so they started actually shutting down the gas field that was producing this leak. But the shutting down of this field took 6 months. And that's why we had the largest gas leak in the history of Kazakhstan. And we actually, again, don't know the real effect that it had on people or on the environment, because it's quite hard to monitor the consequences of these leaks, of these environmental damages, without a proper monitoring of the before and after, let's say. And so in this sense, it's quite difficult to make an assessment of how clean or dirty, let's say, the oil and gas industry is in Kazakhstan, because there's no real monitoring of it. We have even more recent example. We will publish a reportage about the Aktobe region, and we visited the Aktobe Department of Ecology. And because they moved building a year and a half ago, they still don't have a lab. So we have a Department of Ecology that cannot perform lab analysis. You see that cripples in a way the ability for the monitoring agency, the monitoring body, to perform the monitoring itself. So it's really a question of where to put the accent. Do you put the accent on leaving the companies do whatever they want? Or do you actually monitor them and you check on the effects of their extraction process?
So it's true that we can't really identify the exact reason why something is happening. But in terms of Aktobe region, we know that the Caspian seal is dying, the sturgeon is dying, and these are the tangible effects of,
Exactly.
of the environmental damage, which is most likely related to the work of oil and gas companies. And if you would like to find out more about this issue, especially when it comes to the die-off of the Caspian seal, you can go back and read or listen to our report from, I believe, September. But now I would like to ask you about corruption scandals, which have obviously been plenty because oil and gas is a very dirty business. So what is the most memorable scheme or scandal that you covered during your time in Kazakhstan, or that you remember from your work, and that would be emblematic for today's oil and gas industry in Kazakhstan?
I mean, there's plenty. There's really plenty of examples. Of course, I'm not gonna turn this podcast into a 6-hour-long episode, I promise. But again, this is to me one of the main issues. When one thing is oil extraction that benefits the people. But if you add the corruption element, then you're left with very few pennies to reinvest in society. And because you redistributed all the money among you and your friends. And this is what happened at the very beginning, for example. I think the story of the late James Giffen is quite emblematic of how it all started. James Giffen was a US citizen. He died a couple of years ago, and he died a free man despite being investigated for foreign corruption in the US and being sentenced. What happened was that he was the broker of the Tengiz deal, which we earlier talked about as the contract of the century. And so he was the one that brokered the access of Chevron, the American company, into Kazakhstan. And for that reason, he was very close to Nazarbayev. And so he was able to essentially make the parties talk. But the way he did it was not without corruption. He was known as Mr. 7.5 cents because he would make 7.5 cents every barrel of oil that was sold, no matter the price that the barrel was sold at. To put that into perspective, Tengizchevroil, when he was earning that kind of money, they were producing 281,000 barrels per day. So 7.5 cents times 281,000 barrels per day. So he was making a lot of money. Then this essentially was uncovered in the early 2000s when then Prime Minister basically uncovered the fact that they had a private bank account in Switzerland where there was more than $1 billion, which could have been available with the signature of Nazarbayev, the prime minister, and a few other people. And he said, we have this bank account that has some money proceedings from the Tengiz oil deal. And it's a rainy day fund. We will use it if we need it for the country. And everybody else said, if it's with a couple of people's signature, then it's not for the country, it's for you guys. So what are you talking about? It's essentially your bribe. It's not a rainy day fund for the country. That led to the creation of a foundation called the Bota Foundation, which means camel in Kazakh. And the idea was that the money would be returned from Switzerland, from the Swiss bank account, through the Bota Foundation, essentially monitored so that it would go into social projects as opposed to in the pockets of a few people again. So this is one of the few examples of massive corruption for which Giffen appeared in front of the judge and he said, well, I did it because I was an agent of the United States government at the time. You cannot say that I was a corrupted person. I was just doing it for the government. So you cannot sentence me. And they sent him away with if I remember correctly, it was a $25 fine. And, he lived his life free after that. So that's one of the big scandals of the Kazakhstan's oil industry that remains very present in everybody's minds. It became known as the Kazakh Gate. And so that's one of the many. There is plenty of scandals in terms of pipeline deals, in terms of oil that was stolen and then sold in the black market through ships that had different flags. There's a lot of offshoring of the oil proceeds. Another interesting story is the fact that most foreign oil companies reside in the Netherlands, where there's a very favorable tax regime and a very favorable profit repatriation regime with Kazakhstan. And so you see companies that are not Dutch who are based in the Netherlands just for tax dodging, essentially, which is, again, legal practices, but it shows how far the oil dollar travels not to be under the purview of the government, not to be taxed, not to be checked, not to be traced so easily. Beyond the regular corruption for which people sometimes go to jail, sometimes get a slap on the wrist, you see also a lot of attempts to dodge taxes and attempts to dodge control that have essentially led to the extraction of billions and billions of dollars from the country into the pockets of the few. This is yet another negative consequence of the extraction of oil, because oil, again, is extracted and exported. Around 60% of the oil extracted in Kazakhstan is exported. And then the money, the proceeds of this export actually don't stay in Kazakhstan. And so you see that for the Kazakhstani people, oil is this thing that gets, as long as it's in the ground, it's theirs. But then when it's extracted, both the material oil and the proceeds from its sales, they just go somewhere else. And that's why you see that the state of the environment, the state of urban development in these oil regions is subpar compared to other oil extracting countries.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. What is important to add here, I think, is that the details of the deals between oil companies and the Kazakh government have been kept secret, and that an investigation by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists found documents from an arbitration proceeding launched by the Kazakh government against oil companies, which states that 98% of oil proceeds would go to the companies. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? And is this a good deal?
No, 98% is a ripoff in any business deals. If you own
colonialism,
exactly.
Right? I mean, a colonial relationship.
Exactly. It's not a deal. It's direct colonial extraction. Okay, let's say straight away that yes, the contracts are secret, and also the arbitration proceedings are secret. We only know something through leaks, which we were able to verify independently. And when I say we, I mean the people that worked on the story from the consortium of investigative journalists. There's a couple of really brilliant stories that fully explain the process. But for the purpose of our conversation, let's say that essentially now the government is going back to the root of the problem, to the 90s, when these contracts were signed in a way that was extremely favorable to the oil companies. And they're saying that was not fair. So the way that we distributed profits from the extraction of oil was not fair at all. And so you need to both compensate for the way that profits were allocated and also recalculate the costs, which were the actual real deal here. Because essentially, until companies recover costs, they don't share the profits. That's the idea of a so-called production sharing agreement contract. And so these PSA, keyword in this conversation, production sharing agreement, was extremely favorable to the company because, as an investor, you put all the money and you don't share any profits until you've recovered all of the money that you put in. But if you inflate the money that you put in, then, you don't share the profits for years and years and years. And this is essentially what the Kazakh government is accusing the companies of doing. It's accusing them of inflating costs so much that it delayed essentially the sharing of the profits. And so we're talking about many billions of dollars. I believe that $150 billion, like we're dealing with, it might be a little over the real number. But I would say that also, from what we know from a few sources, the offer from the companies of investing a couple of $100 million to make the arbitration proceedings go away, that's also a massive underestimation of the problem. I'm not sure whether the parties will reach an agreement in the middle anytime soon. It could look like another arbitration proceeding that ended last year, the Stati versus Kazakhstan proceedings, which lasted actually for about 13 plus years. So we might be looking at very long, very acrimonious proceedings that will potentially even push out international oil companies that might at some point not want to deal with these proceedings anymore, pay what they need to pay, and just get out of the projects. These are projects. The projects that we're talking about, for example, Kashagan inside the Caspian Sea, it's offshore field. They're quite complicated fields. And even the Western oil companies learned by doing in this case. And the question for Kazakhstan is, does Kazakhstan have the money and expertise to actually carry forward the exploration and production in this field without the presence of the Western oil companies in the case that they actually leave? So that, to the external observer, is perhaps the main question. Is Kazakhstan ready to take the burden of this oil field further?
So we're slowly reaching the end of our conversation, but there is one thing that we haven't mentioned in this discussion, and that is Russia. So how does Russia position itself in the Kazakh oil industry? How important it is as a player?
Let me try to be brief. Obviously, Russia is a key player in Kazakhstan's oil and gas industry, even though it doesn't really have much investment in Kazakhstan's oil and gas industry. Because if you look at the major investors, they're, again, American, Chinese, Italian, Dutch. But in terms of the way that oil travels, Russia is a major point of exit for Kazakhstan's oil. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium we talked before is going through Russia. The Druzhba pipeline goes through Russia. And so about 90+% of Kazakhstan oil exports go through Russia. And this is important because Kazakhstan has to try to diversify. They keep talking about diversifying oil routes, but they can't. Even the Kazakhstan to China pipeline is actually currently used mostly by Russia because Russia is renting the pipeline to send oil to China. And so in this way, Russia plays a massive role for Kazakhstan. And we can see it these months, these weeks, when there was a drone attack carried out by Ukrainian forces against the marine terminal at Novorossiysk, which is where the Caspian Pipeline Consortium ends. And this is obviously within the framework of the war in Ukraine, which was obviously provoked by the Russian aggression in February 2022. And Ukraine essentially is trying to hit very key logistical hubs in Russia to weaken the Russian war effort. But by hitting the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal, they actually hit Kazakhstan's oil exports. And so there was a moment in which essentially the Kazakhstan diplomacy told Ukraine to stop attacking specifically the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal, the marine terminal at Novorossiysk, because they were actually hitting Kazakhstan and not Russia. So in a way, it's so intertwined, Kazakhstan's oil sector and Russia itself, that this diversification of oil routes has not happened. And we will see for the decades to come Russia's role as the main country for transit of Kazakhstan's oil.
Thank you so much, Paolo, for your insights. And I wish you all the best in the new year, and also obviously all the best with your new podcast, which I'm definitely going to listen to in the coming year. All the best to you and all the best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.